A retired CIA operative seeks solitude in a remote cabin until a storm forces a group of cartel men to invade his home. One by one, they start disappearing, realizing too late that their harmless target is a trained killer. But just as he eliminates their leader, reinforcements arrive, and he discovers the storm raged outside, a relentless downpour hammering against the wooden walls of the isolated cabin. Thunder rumbled across the valley, shaking the very foundation of the old structure. Samuel Sam Duval sat in the darkness, his breathing steady, his body still. He had lived in this cabin for years, away from the chaos of the world, but tonight trouble had come knocking. The first sign had been the headlights cutting through the trees, flickering through the rain like predatory eyes. Then came the heavy boots on the porch, the murmured voices barely audible over the storm. Sam had seen their kind before, men who carried trouble like a second skin. He didn't know their story, but he knew their type, and he knew what they were capable of. The door burst open with a violent shove, the wind howling in as four figures stepped inside. Their leader, a tall man with sharp features and cold eyes, surveyed the room. Miguel El Sombra Torres. Sam had heard whispers of that name before. Cartel business. The others followed. Javier El Chueco Rios, his scarred face twisted in impatience. Marco El Flaco Diaz, younger, greener, his hands shaking slightly as he clutched a rifle. And then there was the woman. She entered last, silent and tense, her gaze sweeping across the room. Carla Velasquez. Sam could tell at a glance. She wasn't with them by choice. Miguel's eyes roamed the cabin, unimpressed. It was a simple place. A fireplace in the corner, a kitchen along the back wall, a single hallway leading to the bedrooms. A lonely old man's house, or so they thought. "This will do," Miguel muttered, shaking rain from his jacket. "For now." Sam remained hidden, watching from the shadows between the wooden beams of the loft above. He had seen them coming. He had prepared. These men thought they had stumbled upon a harmless old hermit, a man too weak to resist, too afraid to fight back. They were wrong. Marco dropped his bag on the floor with a heavy thud. "We should check the place," he said, rubbing his arms against the cold. Javier shot him a glare. "No one's here, idiot. You think someone's living out here in this storm?" Marco hesitated but nodded. Carla stood near the door, arms crossed, shivering slightly. Her expression was unreadable, but Sam noticed the way she kept glancing toward the hallway. She was looking for a way out. Smart. Miguel walked deeper into the room, eyeing the furniture, the old hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace. He gestured to Javier. "Check the back. See if there's anything useful." Javier grumbled but obeyed, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Marco hesitated before following. Sam exhaled silently. They had underestimated him, and that was their first mistake. He had spent his life in the shadows, trained to observe, to strike only when necessary. His hands flexed, the old instincts stirring. He counted their weapons, their movements, their weaknesses. A storm outside, a storm inside. The hunt had begun. That escaping the past is never that easy. Sam remained motionless in the shadows of the loft, his breath controlled, his mind calculating. The cartel men moved carelessly, assuming they had stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, or, at worst, an old hermit too weak to be a threat. That assumption would cost them. Below, Marco El Flaco Diaz hesitated at the entrance to the hallway, his grip on his rifle unsteady. He was young, inexperienced, a weak link. Javier El Chueco Rios, on the other hand, moved with the confidence of a man who had seen violence and delivered it. He pushed past Marco, scoffing at his hesitation. "Move, Flaco," Javier growled, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. "You afraid of ghosts?" Marco swallowed hard but followed. Sam tracked their movements, listening to their footsteps disappear down the corridor. He'd spent years in this cabin, and he knew every board that creaked, every blind spot where a man could hide. Miguel remained in the living area, examining the fireplace. His sharp eyes scanned the mounted rifle above it, his mind likely weighing whether the weapon was functional. Across the room, Carla Velasquez stood by the door, arms still crossed. She was out of place here, not just physically, but in the way she carried herself. She wasn't like them. Sam shifted his focus. The priority was eliminating the threat, and that meant taking out the weakest first. His eyes locked onto Marco. Javier moved deeper into the hallway, pushing open doors and sweeping his gun inside each room. Marco lingered at the entrance of the last room, the storage room. Sam had already predicted it. That was where they would look next. Silent as death, Sam descended from the loft, his feet landing softly on the wooden floor. The storm raged outside, masking any faint sounds of movement. He glided through the shadows, heading for the hallway. Javier was distracted, barking orders at Marco. "Go in. What the hell are you waiting for?" Marco hesitated, then nodded, stepping into the darkened storage room. That was his second mistake. Sam moved like a phantom, slipping in behind him just as the door creaked shut. Marco barely had time to turn before an arm wrapped around his throat, cutting off his breath. He struggled, but Sam tightened his grip, his movements efficient, controlled. The boy kicked, his fingers clawing at the arm locked around his windpipe. His rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering softly onto the floor. Javier heard nothing over the wind and rain. Marco's struggles weakened. His body convulsed once, then went limp. Sam lowered him gently to the ground, his pulse already fading into silence. One down. Sam retrieved Marco's rifle and stepped out of the storage room, moving soundlessly back into the shadows before Javier could turn around. When the older cartel member finally glanced over his shoulder, his impatience flared. "Marco!" he called out, stepping toward the door. Silence. Javier frowned, pushing the door open wider. His gun lifted slightly as he peered inside, his body tense. Stillness. Marco lay motionless on the ground, his face hidden in the shadows. Javier cursed under his breath, stepping inside to check on him. Sam watched from the darkness. He could strike again, but not yet. He had to let the paranoia settle in first. Javier knelt, nudging Marco's body. The younger man didn't move. Something was wrong. "Flaco?" Javier whispered, reaching to shake him. Sam exhaled slowly. The game had begun. Javier's fingers barely brushed Marco's shoulder when a cold realization gripped him. This wasn't sleep. It was something else. He recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. The storm outside masked most sounds, but an eerie silence had settled inside the cabin. Marco was dead. Javier shot to his feet, gun raised, eyes darting around the darkened room. He hadn't heard anything. No struggle, no gunshot, nothing. That meant one thing. Someone had done this up close, silently. "Mierda," he hissed under his breath. He backed out of the storage room, gun sweeping from side to side as he re-entered the hallway. Miguel needed to know. "Boss," Javier called, his voice sharp with tension. Miguel turned from the fireplace, brow furrowing at the tone. "What?" Javier hesitated for half a second, as if still trying to process the reality of what had just happened. Then his instincts took over. "Flaco's gone," he said, voice lower now, cautious. "Somebody else is here." Miguel's expression darkened instantly. His hand went to his belt, drawing a pistol. Carla tensed by the door, her eyes flicking between the two men, but she said nothing. Sam watched from the shadows near the hallway entrance. They were alert now, but alert didn't mean safe. The seed of paranoia had been planted. "Are you sure?" Miguel asked, his tone dangerously calm. Javier gave him a hard look. "He's dead." A slow exhale from Miguel, then he turned to Carla. "Did you see anything?" She shook her head quickly, but her eyes betrayed her. She was putting things together now, realizing that the unseen threat might be her way out. Miguel clenched his jaw. He didn't like surprises, and this was a problem. "Javier, check the rest of the house. If someone is here, find them." Javier didn't argue. He clicked on a flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness as he advanced down the hall. Sam stayed still. Movement was death. They had numbers, but they also had fear working against them. Miguel turned to Carla again. "Stay here." She nodded, but her fingers curled slightly at her sides, her mind clearly racing. She wasn't just waiting for orders, she was thinking, calculating. Good, Sam thought. That meant she wouldn't get in his way. Javier's flashlight swept over the walls, the ceiling, the floor. He checked under tables, behind chairs, inside closets. Every second that passed without finding anything made his pulse hammer harder. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. Miguel didn't respond. He simply stood there, eyes scanning the darkness, listening. He had been in too many situations like this to dismiss his instincts. Someone was here. Someone who knew how to stay invisible. Javier reached the last door at the end of the hall, the bedroom. He hesitated only a fraction before gripping the doorknob and shoving it open. Nothing. Empty. The only sound was the wind rattling the window pane. And then, a loud crash came from the kitchen. Both men spun around, guns raised. Carla flinched, Miguel's grip on his pistol tightened. "Javier!" But Javier was already moving, rushing back toward the source of the noise. Miguel followed. Sam watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. A simple trick, an old shelf near the kitchen, loosened just enough so that it would fall with the right vibration. He had barely needed to touch it. Now, they were chasing ghosts. He moved in the opposite direction, slipping past the hallway as Miguel and Javier focused on the kitchen. Carla turned her head slightly, catching just the faintest hint of movement, but she didn't say anything. Sam disappeared into the shadows once more. The game was his to control now. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's windows as if the storm itself had come alive. Inside, Miguel and Javier moved cautiously, their guns raised, their nerves stretched thin. The crash in the kitchen had sent them scrambling, but now, standing among the overturned shelves and scattered utensils, it was clear. There was no one there. "Damn it," Javier hissed, scanning the corners of the dimly lit space. "He's playing with us." Miguel remained silent, his jaw tightening. He had been in enough fights to recognize the signs. This wasn't some frightened old man trying to hide. This was a calculated hunter, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate his prey. And now, they were the prey. Carla stood near the doorway, her posture tense, her mind working fast. Whoever this invisible adversary was, they had already taken down Marco without a sound. And yet, she was still standing. Why? A cold realization settled in her chest. This person, whoever he was choosing his targets carefully. That meant there was still a way out of this for her. Javier moved past the kitchen, sweeping his flashlight toward the hallway again. "He's in here somewhere," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Miguel nodded, but his focus was shifting. The storm, the silence between each attack, the precise way this ghost-like enemy was striking, it felt familiar. Too familiar. "Keep your eyes open," he ordered. "He's watching us." And he was right. Sam crouched in the loft once more, his breathing controlled, his pulse steady. He had spent years perfecting the art of patience. The key to survival wasn't brute strength or sheer firepower. It was control. And right now he had full control over the battlefield. He studied their movements, memorizing every nervous glance, every shift in their weight, every sign of paranoia creeping into their minds. They were starting to break. That was the moment to strike again. But before he could, Carla did something unexpected. She moved. It was subtle, just a step toward the hallway, as if testing the waters. Javier barely noticed, too focused on checking the dark corners ahead. But Miguel did. His sharp gaze snapped toward her. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Carla stopped. Maybe we should leave," she said carefully. "If someone's here, we don't know how many there are." Javier scoffed, not looking back. "You scared now?" "Maybe she's right," Miguel said, surprising them both. Javier finally turned, his brow furrowing. "You're joking." Miguel's expression remained unreadable. "Someone took out Flaco without a sound. They're using the storm, the darkness. This isn't some scared civilian, Javier. This is someone who knows how to kill." Javier hesitated, processing the weight of those words. Sam remained in place, watching, waiting. Carla was buying him time, though he wasn't sure if she meant to. Then the storm outside intensified. A particularly strong gust of wind slammed against the cabin, shaking the wooden walls. For a split second, the power flickered. That was all Sam needed. The moment the light dimmed, he moved. Silent, precise. Javier turned instinctively at the shift in the air behind him, but it was already too late. Sam's arm wrapped around his throat, dragging him backward into the shadows. Javier choked, struggling, but Sam's grip was absolute. Miguel spun just as the light stabilized, his gun raising. But there was nothing to see, just empty space where Javier had been standing a second ago. Carla's breath hitched. Javier was gone. The storm raged on. The hunt continued. Javier struggled, his body thrashing as Sam dragged him into the darkness of the hallway. His fingers clawed at the arm wrapped around his throat, but the grip was unyielding, precise, the kind of hold only a trained killer could execute. Sam felt the fight draining from Javier's muscles. He tightened his grip, ensuring there was no chance of escape. Seconds later, Javier's body went limp. Sam eased him down, his movements controlled, silent. Another one down. Back in the living area, Miguel stood frozen, his gun raised, eyes scanning the shadows. "Javier?" he called, his voice firm. No answer. The cabin was deathly quiet now. the storm outside raging louder than ever. Carla's breathing had become shallow. Her eyes flicked between the hallway where Javier had disappeared and Miguel, who now stood alone. Fear and realization dawned in her gaze. Whoever this man in the shadows was, he was no ordinary opponent. Miguel's fingers flexed around his pistol. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "I know what you are," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Sam watched from the darkness. His presence was a ghost lingering just out of reach. He remained unseen, but he could feel Miguel's mind working, pieces falling into place. Then, Miguel did something unexpected. He turned and walked toward the nearest bookshelf. Carla tensed as she watched him pull a dusty book from the top shelf. The action seemed insignificant until she saw what was behind it. A worn-out folder, thick with old documents. Miguel pulled it out and flipped it open. His eyes skimmed the pages, and then a slow smirk curled his lips. "Now it makes sense," he murmured. Carla frowned. "What is that?" Miguel glanced at her, then held the folder up. "This," he said, tapping a faded identification card inside, "is our ghost." Carla leaned closer, her eyes widening as she saw the name printed on the card, Samuel Duval. The photo was of a younger man, but the cold eyes were unmistakable. Below the name, bold letters stood out, Central Intelligence Agency. Sam remained hidden, watching, waiting. His past was no longer a secret. Miguel chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "We walked into a damn lion's den," he muttered. He flipped through more documents, classified reports, old mission logs, details of covert operations. CIA, Special Operations. This guy isn't just some retired agent, he was a hunter. Carla felt her pulse quicken. Everything started making sense. The way Sam had moved, how he had taken down Marco and Javier without a trace. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a predator. Miguel exhaled sharply and snapped the folder shut. He looked at Carla, his smirk returning. "Well, at least we know what we're up against." Carla swallowed hard. "Then we need to leave." Miguel didn't answer immediately. His fingers tapped against the folder, his mind weighing options. He knew he was outmatched. This was no longer a simple hideout. They were trapped inside a battlefield. Then his gaze darkened with determination. "No," he said, slipping the folder under his arm. "Now we change the plan." Carla's stomach clenched at the tone of his voice. "What do you mean?" Miguel's smirk widened as he glanced toward the shadows. "If he's really ex-CIA, then he's worth more alive than dead." Before Carla could react, Miguel pulled out his radio. "Javier's down," he said into the static, "but we have an asset. Prepare to move in." Carla's blood ran cold. More were coming, and Sam knew it. Sam remained in the shadows, listening as Miguel's voice crackled through the radio. Reinforcements were coming. That changed the game. He had no doubt that Miguel had just made a desperate call to whatever cartel forces were close enough to respond. Time was now his enemy. Carla's eyes flicked toward the radio, tension tightening her posture. She had known Miguel long enough to understand that when he called someone an asset, it never meant anything good. "That's a mistake," she said, her voice quieter now, almost careful. Miguel glanced at her, intrigued. "Is it?" "He's already taken out 2 of your men without making a sound," she continued. "And if reinforcements are coming, that means you're trapped here with him until they arrive. You think he's going to let you walk out of this alive?" Miguel smirked, adjusting his grip on his pistol. "That's why I'm about to make him an offer." Carla didn't respond, but her mind was racing. She had to figure out a way out of this before Miguel's plan unfolded. The cartel leader turned toward the dark corners of the cabin, his voice calm but firm. "I know you're listening, Sam," he called out, his smirk lingering. "And I know who you are now. Special operations, deep cover assignments. You've spent your life hunting men like me. But that was a long time ago, wasn't it?" Silence. Miguel chuckled. "You could have run. You could have taken out 1 or 2 of us and slipped into the night. But you didn't. You stayed." He glanced at Carla briefly before looking back into the darkness. "I think I know why." Sam remained hidden, watching, waiting. Miguel's tone shifted slightly, growing more calculated. "A man like you, ex-CIA living alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere? That tells me something. It tells me you're tired, maybe even looking for a way out." Carla stiffened. She knew exactly what Miguel was doing. He was planting a seed, trying to shift the battlefield from the physical to the psychological. Miguel took a slow step forward. We're not that different, you and I, he continued. We've both seen things most men can't imagine. We've both had to do things we can't take back. The difference is I stopped pretending I was the hero a long time ago. Still no response. Miguel smirked. So here's my offer. Help me get out of here, and I'll make sure you get something in return. Money, protection. Hell, if you want to disappear for good, I can make that happen too. Carla's stomach twisted. You think he's going to trust you? She scoffed. Miguel turned to her, his smirk never faltering. Why wouldn't he? Right now, the only thing standing between him and a bullet to the head is me. Carla clenched her jaw, knowing there was no reasoning with Miguel. He truly believed he could manipulate his way out of this. And that was when Sam finally spoke. Your mistake, his voice came from the shadows, low and calm, is thinking you still have control. Miguel's smirk faltered. The voice was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom slipping through the darkness. You're outnumbered, Miguel countered, eyes scanning for movement. For now, Sam said. The radio crackled. Miguel barely had time to react before Carla did something unexpected. She lunged. Her hands shot toward Javier's discarded gun on the floor, but Miguel was faster. He turned, grabbed her wrist, and yanked her forward, twisting her arm behind her back. She gasped in pain. Miguel's smirk returned. That was dumb. Sam tightened his grip on his knife, muscles coiled, ready. Miguel had just given him the perfect reason to end this. Before the reinforcements even arrived, the storm raged outside. The endgame had begun. The storm roared outside, thunder shaking the cabin's walls as Miguel tightened his grip on Carla's wrist. She gritted her teeth, pain flashing across her face, but she didn't make a sound. Miguel's smirk widened. He liked control. You don't get it, do you? He murmured. I'm the only thing keeping you alive, sweetheart. Carla shot him a glare, but before she could respond, the shadows moved. A sharp whistle cut through the air. Miguel barely had time to react before something struck his wrist, hard. A flash of silver, a knife. He grunted, the sudden impact forcing his fingers to release Carla. She stumbled forward, free, just as Miguel's pistol clattered to the floor. Then, chaos erupted. Sam emerged from the darkness like a specter, moving with terrifying speed. Miguel barely had time to register the attack before Sam's fist connected with his jaw, sending him reeling backward. Carla dove for the discarded pistol, fingers closing around the grip. But before she could raise it, a new threat exploded into the room. Javier, bloodied but alive. His face was twisted with fury, one hand clutching his bruised throat where Sam had nearly ended him. His other hand held his gun, already raised, already aimed. Carla barely had time to gasp before the gunfire erupted. Sam moved first, shoving Carla to the ground as Javier's bullet ripped through the air. It missed, lodging itself into the wooden beam where she had just been standing. Javier cursed, adjusting his aim, but Sam was already on him. It happened fast, a blur of movement, a single, precise strike. Sam's knife sliced through Javier's wrist. The gun fell. Javier barely had time to scream before Sam grabbed him by the collar and twisted, slamming him against the nearest wall. The old wooden cabin shook with the impact. Javier's breath left him in a wheeze, his body going limp for a fraction of a second, just enough time for Sam to finish the job. One swift motion, a blade to the throat. Javier choked, eyes wide with shock. Then silence. He slumped against the wall, lifeless. Sam exhaled, yanking his knife free. The cabin was eerily quiet now, save for the raging storm outside. Carla scrambled to her feet, pistol in hand, her breaths coming fast. She turned, expecting to see Miguel fleeing, trying to make his escape. But Miguel wasn't running. He was smiling. The smirk was back, even as he clutched his bleeding wrist, even as he stood unarmed, staring at the bodies of his men. Sam took a slow step forward, knife still dripping. You should have run, Miguel chuckled. And missed the fun. He shook his head. Nah, I still have a few tricks left. Then he did the last thing they expected. He reached into his jacket. Carla tensed, raising the pistol. Don't move! But Miguel wasn't going for a weapon. He pulled out a lighter. Sam's eyes flicked toward the floor, toward the trail of gasoline Miguel had deliberately spilled from a knocked-over lantern during the struggle. Miguel grinned. Let's turn up the heat. Then he flicked the lighter on, a single flame. A heartbeat later, he dropped it. The fire caught instantly, roaring to life, consuming the dry wooden floors in seconds. Carla gasped, stepping back as the flames spread. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, thick and suffocating. Miguel took advantage of the distraction. He bolted for the door, disappearing into the storm outside. Sam clenched his jaw. The bastard had set the entire place ablaze. There was no choice. They had to get out. Now. The fire spread fast. Within seconds, flames licked up the wooden walls, smoke curling toward the ceiling like writhing fingers. The heat was already unbearable. Sam grabbed Carla's arm and pulled her toward the door. "Move!" She didn't hesitate. They sprinted through the living room, dodging falling embers as the fire devoured the cabin. The smoke made it hard to see, to breathe. Carla coughed, covering her mouth with her sleeve. Outside, the storm raged. Rain slammed against the earth in thick sheets, but it wouldn't be enough to stop the fire. The cabin was old, dry, built to burn, and Miguel knew it. As they burst through the front door, Sam's instincts screamed at him. Trap. He shoved Carla aside just as a gunshot split the air. The bullet whizzed past, barely missing them. Sam rolled into the mud, his knife still clutched tightly. Carla hit the ground beside him, panting, eyes wide. Miguel stood several yards away, just at the tree line, his pistol raised. He was bleeding from the wound on his wrist, his face twisted in a mixture of pain and exhilaration. Behind him, the dark forest stretched endlessly, a perfect hunting ground. "You're good, viejo," Miguel called out over the storm, his voice laced with amusement. "But let's see how well you do out here." Sam's fingers clenched around his blade. He could see it in Miguel's stance. He wasn't trying to escape. He wanted this fight. The fire roared behind them, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. Sam had spent years in the darkness, but so had Miguel. "Stay low," Sam whispered to Carla. "Stay behind me." She nodded, gripping the stolen pistol in her hands, though Sam could see the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't a killer, not like them. Miguel took a slow step back, disappearing into the trees. Sam exhaled. Fine. If Miguel wanted a hunt, he'd get one. He motioned for Carla to stay put, and then moved forward, slipping into the shadows of the forest. The trees swayed violently in the wind, the rain hammering down through the leaves. Darkness consumed everything. It was the kind of night where predators thrived. Sam moved carefully, placing each step with precision. He knew this land, knew every dip in the earth, every hidden path. Miguel, however, was unpredictable. A faint rustling to the left. Sam dropped into a crouch just as a blade slashed through the air, narrowly missing his throat. He spun, blocking the next attack with his forearm. Miguel was on him, a vicious grin on his face as their knives clashed in the dark. "Not bad, viejo," Miguel taunted, pressing forward. "Still got some fight left in you?" Sam didn't answer. He just moved. A twist, a feint, a calculated strike. Miguel grunted as Sam's knife sliced through his shoulder, drawing blood. He staggered back, but his smirk never faded. "That all you got?" Sam didn't waste time with words. He lunged. Miguel dodged, but it was a mistake. His foot caught on something in the underbrush, a tripwire. The second he triggered it, the ground gave way beneath him. Miguel barely had time to react before he was falling, crashing into a deep pit lined with sharpened wooden stakes. Sam stood at the edge, watching. The trap had been there for years, something he had set long ago to keep predators away. Tonight, it had found its purpose. Miguel groaned, impaled through the leg, his smirk finally gone. Carla emerged from the darkness behind Sam, her breath catching as she saw Miguel struggling in the pit. "You planned this," she whispered. Sam's gaze didn't waver. No, he walked into it himself. Miguel coughed, spitting blood. "You think this is over?" Sam's eyes were cold. "I know it is." And then, the final act began. The storm raged on, the wind howling through the trees as rain poured in thick sheets. The fire from the cabin flickered in the distance, its glow barely visible through the dense forest. But Sam wasn't watching the fire. He was watching Miguel. The cartel leader was trapped, his body half impaled on one of the sharpened stakes at the bottom of the pit. Blood seeped from his leg, his face contorted in pain, but he still had that damn smirk. Sam didn't move. He stood at the edge, his knife glinting under the flashes of lightning. Carla lingered behind him, gripping the stolen pistol with shaking hands. "You think this is how it ends?" Miguel rasped, his voice strained but taunting. "You think you've won?" Sam's expression remained unreadable. "It's over, Miguel." Miguel chuckled, wincing at the pain. "You don't get it, viejo. You can kill me, but it won't stop them. More will come. You know how this works." Sam did know. He'd spent a lifetime in the shadows, hunting men like Miguel. And he knew that killing one cartel leader wouldn't end the war. But that didn't mean he would let Miguel walk away. Miguel shifted, reaching slowly toward his belt. Sam's grip on his knife tightened. "Don't," he warned. But Miguel didn't listen. With a sudden, desperate motion, he yanked out a small pistol he had hidden in his waistband and fired. Sam dodged, the bullet grazing his side. Before Miguel could take a second shot, Sam was already in motion. He leaped into the pit. Carla gasped as Sam dropped down, landing hard but balanced. Miguel tried to raise his gun again, but Sam was faster. His hand clamped over Miguel's wrist, twisting it violently. A sharp crack. Miguel screamed, the gun falling from his grip. Sam didn't stop. He drove his knee into Miguel's chest, forcing him further onto the stake that had pierced his leg. Miguel howled in agony. The fight was over. Sam grabbed Miguel by the collar, pulling him close. Rain dripped from both their faces, mixing with the blood. "You never had control," Sam murmured. Miguel coughed, his breath ragged. "You think you're different from me?" He chuckled weakly, shaking his head. "We're the same, viejo. Killers, survivors. It never ends." Sam stared at him, his grip tightening. He had spent years running from what he was, from what he had done. But Miguel was wrong. Sam had never enjoyed killing. He had never smirked in the face of death, and that was the difference. Sam's knife flashed one last time. Miguel's body jerked, his smirk finally fading. His breath left him in a slow, shuddering exhale. His head slumped. It was done. Sam exhaled, his body aching. He let Miguel's lifeless form drop against the pit's muddy floor. A moment of silence, just the rain, the wind, the distant crackling of the dying fire. Then, "Sam!" Carla's voice snapped him back. He turned, climbing out of the pit as quickly as his wounds allowed. Carla was there, gripping his arm, pulling him up. "You okay?" she asked, eyes searching his face. Sam nodded. "Yeah," she exhaled in relief. But then she glanced toward the distance, her expression darkening. "More will come," she murmured. Sam followed her gaze toward the road where distant headlights flickered through the rain. Reinforcements. They weren't done yet. And Sam knew. He still had one last fight ahead of him. The rain poured relentlessly, washing away the blood that stained the ground. The fire in the distance had begun to die, reduced to glowing embers and rising smoke. But the battle wasn't over. Sam and Carla stood at the edge of the forest, their breaths heavy, their bodies bruised. Across the muddy road, the glow of approaching headlights sliced through the darkness. "They're coming," Carla whispered, gripping the pistol tightly. Sam's mind raced. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before the reinforcements arrived. Staying meant a fight they couldn't win, but running meant giving up the home he had built, the solitude he had earned. Carla turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What do we do?" Sam exhaled slowly. He knew what had to be done. "We leave," he said. Carla hesitated, as if she hadn't expected that answer. "Just like that?" Sam glanced back toward the burning remains of his cabin. He had lived there for years, in the quiet and the shadows. But that life was gone now. The past had caught up with him, and it wouldn't stop here. He turned to Carla. "You want to stay and fight?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. She wasn't a killer, and she didn't want to die here. Finally, she shook her head. "No." Sam nodded. "Then we go." The headlights grew closer, tires grinding against the wet dirt road. Sam could see the outlines of vehicles, black SUVs, cartel soldiers inside, armed and ready. They were out of time. Sam grabbed Carla's wrist and pulled her into the forest. "This way." They moved fast, their feet sinking into the wet earth as they disappeared into the trees. The darkness swallowed them whole, the storm masking their escape. Behind them, the SUVs came to a halt. Doors slammed. Shouts echoed through the night. "Busquen por todas partes." They were hunting ghosts. But Sam was already gone. They didn't stop moving until the night began to fade. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold mist that clung to the trees. Sam finally slowed, his body protesting with every step. Carla followed, her breath uneven but steady. "Where are we going?" she asked. Sam looked ahead, past the dense forest, toward the distant horizon. He had spent years running from his past, hiding from the world. But the truth was, there was no more hiding. He glanced at Carla, the woman who had been caught in the middle of this war, who had survived against impossible odds. "You have anywhere to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not anymore." Sam sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. He hadn't planned on this. Honor. But something inside him had shifted. He couldn't go back to his old life, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he wanted to. He turned toward Carla. Then we find somewhere new. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Together, they walked forward, leaving the past and the bodies behind. For Sam, the war wasn't over. The cartel would come looking for him. They always did. But now he had a reason to keep moving. And maybe, just maybe, a reason to fight again. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and the battles we think we've left behind find a way to catch up with us. Sam thought he had escaped the war, but when danger came knocking, he had no choice but to fight once more. In the end, survival wasn't just about strength. It was about knowing when to walk away and when to stand your ground. But what would you have done in his place? Would you have fought until the end or disappeared into the shadows? Click on the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and dive into more thrilling stories that challenge the mind. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.